You know what I love about reading these old video game magazines? I guess it's a pretty big nostalgia trip or whatever, but I more so love bringing myself back to a time where things were really different. And I don't mean that in a way that's like, back in my day, video games were different sort of way. No, not at all. I mean, like, before games came out, they were literally different.
You're flipping on through and you see the GameCube being called the Dolphin, or Majora's Mask being previewed as Zelda Gaiden, articles about Kirby Air Ride when it was still an N64 game. It's easy to forget when something's been out for decades and we've kinda come to know it as it is now, but when something is still in development, it often looks and sounds a lot different than what it became.
But I think what's most interesting to me is when these relics of the past are preserved in really weird ways, you know, like when a quote from a magazine is printed on the cover of a game for everybody to see, and then as time goes on, people are still aware of that quote, but it starts to make less and less sense as the years go by.
Bubsy 3D, this is one of the best examples of this. It's hard to believe that anybody has ever said anything good about this game, given its reputation as one of the most rancid 3D platformers of all time, but that's because this was taken from a preview of a work in progress, and not a critical review of the final product. Another fairly infamous example comes from a PlayStation exclusive platformer called 40 Winks. Despite never releasing on a Nintendo platform, it has a quote from Nintendo Official Magazine. Move over, Mario. What is going on here? That'd be like seeing a quote on the cover of Banjo-Kazooie from PSM comparing it to Crash Bandicoot. What happened here? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. It was going to release multi-platform, but the N64 version got cancelled. However, it got cancelled so close to release that it ended up getting a lot of coverage in Nintendo outlets. Nintendo Official Magazine UK even had 40 Winks representing the issue's cover, with a detailed 8-page preview full of tons of info hyping the game up. This is where that quote came from. You don't even need to crack the thing open, it's right there on the magazine's cover. But that's not the only Nintendo magazine to have 40 Winks coverage. Volume 124 of Nintendo Power, the monthly poster was 40 Winks. How weird is that? My absolute favorite though is how it was even reviewed by Nintendo Power. Pretty well even too. How many cancelled games get played to completion and scored by critics? Imagine everyone's confusion back then. Whatever happened to that game Nintendo Power reviewed? They reviewed it, it must have been finished. But that's the thing. This game was finished. It was completed in its entirety for release on N64. So the question is, why didn't it release? Supposedly the publisher, G1 Interactive, was really unsatisfied with the PlayStation version sales so far, so I guess with cartridge costs being considerably higher than PlayStation discs, they must have thought it wouldn't have been worth it. Like, why print all of those copies and spend all that money making them if it wasn't going to turn a big profit, right? Like a lot of cancellations, it was just the unfortunate result of business. But would you believe that about 20 years later, 40 Winks would finally see a physical release on N64? In early 2018, Pico Interactive, a company that focuses on printing new copies of games for older consoles, launched a Kickstarter to finally print and sell the N64 version of 40 Winks. And what do you know? The Kickstarter was fully funded. It was a success. And now, here I am, standing here today, with a physical copy of 40 Winks on N64. How cool is that? Now, 20 years later, this quote kinda makes sense. Though it would have made more sense if they also put it on the cartridge, but they didn't. Would have been cool. You can really tell it's not an official cart. The sticker doesn't have that same texture as official games. It's way more plasticky and reflective, and the sticker on the back is totally different than what you'd be used to seeing, but the biggest thing here that I noticed was the screws. It doesn't use those safety screws that require a special screw head. Instead, it's just ordinary Phillips screws. Of course, these things are pretty negligible. It's kind of expected actually, since it's not a licensed product, and in the end it doesn't really matter at all, but I figured I'd just evaluate the physical presentation of this thing for those who are curious how it stacked up against a real cartridge. And yeah, with all that said, what are we waiting for? Let's see what this game is all about. Of course, I will be playing primarily the N64 version, but I will play a little bit of the PS1 version so I can draw comparisons and stuff. Oh, Eurocom made this. Wow, hell yeah, like these guys made like my favorite platformer that I ever discovered through making videos on this channel. Sphinx, and The Cursed Mummy. That's available on Switch and PC now, by the way. Like, go pick that thing up. That game is super good. But if you're not terribly familiar with their Egyptian endeavors, you might know these guys for making some of those dope-ass James Bond games from the early 2000s. Nightfire especially. I still consider that one of the best Bond games ever made. Like, forget GoldenEye, dude. Nightfire is where it's at. These guys didn't really do original IPs that often. They mostly just stuck to licensed games, but when they did try something original, I guess they fancied the platforming genre. Now, it is really easy to say that the same people made both games when you see the same logo on both covers, but you gotta keep in mind, companies are big. They're made of a lot of employees, so just because both games were developed under the same umbrella, that doesn't necessarily mean the same people made both titles. That's why I always cross-reference the credits to make sure I see a couple of common names before I make that claim. So let's see. Yeah, 3 of the programmers did work on both games, and 1 of the 3D animators did, but other than that, I'm not seeing any more names aside from special thanks. But special thanks is usually just like moral support, getting each other coffee, you know, rooting each other on. Yeah, good to make sure before you make that claim, because I see a lot of people do that without doing this, and you don't want to look like a big poo-poo dum-dum idiot spreading misinformation. I know I've done that before. Speaking of animation, 40 Winks begins with a really impressive real-time cutscene. This might not look super great by today's standards, but man, for the N64, these are some seriously good-looking models and animations. Look at the hands! Every finger is individually modeled and animated. That is so rare for N64. Usually they just have these big block hands with fingers drawn on them. Of course, this sequence doesn't hold a candle to the pre-rendered version that the PS1 has, but it's still really freaking cool to see how faithfully they managed to recreate it in real time on such limiting hardware. So basically what's going on here is this mother is putting her children to sleep, and when one of them complains that going to bed is boring, she tries to make it sound fun.
Elevator brain activity's boring.
That's a really good line. Oh man, the dialogue and characters and everything here, it's super duper charming. It's like a genuinely good kid show. Stupidly enough, some reviewers actually panned this game for the cutesy tone. That is so dumb. Games don't need to be edgy and macho to appeal to adults. Could you imagine if this mindset still existed with reviewers today?
Oh, that's really cute. Aww, that's adorable. 4 out of 10.
The mother explains that in the world of sleep, there's these little creatures called winks, and they make sure people have the sweetest of dreams possible.
But Mom, sometimes I have a dream and it's not like that at all. It's scary.
And then she also explains that there's these evil little critters called hoodwinks, and these guys create nightmares. But luckily the winks are there to fight them off and make sure people still have good dreams. Meanwhile, this grumpy old man named Nightcap is sick and tired, goddammit. He's totally sick of never being able to get a good night's sleep, so out of a selfish rage, he orders his little teddy bear henchman dude to go kidnap all of the winks to assure that nobody else can ever have a good night's sleep again.
If I can't get a good night's sleep, then why should anyone else? From now on, sweet dreams have been cancelled.
Where have I heard that voice before? I know I've heard that voice in like another N64 game, I think. I know I've heard that before.
Bouncing on presents seems like a good idea to me, sir.
Oh, that's it, Gex 3. I can't say that's really what I was expecting, but yeah, that's where I recognize this guy's voice from, the turtle in Gex 3. It's Mark Silk, and he totally steals the show. Nightcap is a total goofball. He's a really entertaining villain. I really wish we got to see more of him in the N64 version. There was a lot of cutscenes throughout the game in the PS1 version, but these were all scrapped from the N64 version for what I would assume was cartridge space. Only the first and final cutscenes made the cut, which is understandable, but it's still pretty disappointing. I was kind of sick of his face by the end of the game, though. You have to look at it every single time you save. Every time I hear that sound, all I can think of is... Lonnie Minella provides the voice for our 2 protagonists, Ruff and Tumble. Those are really great names. She's been in like a bajillion things, but some notable examples you might recognize. She was Rouge in SA2, Ivy in Soul Calibur, Luke in Professor Layton, of course, Lucas in Smash Bros, Bubsy in Bubsy 3D. Yeah, I guess we all have our low points in our careers, I guess. When you start a new game, you get to pick which one of these 2 characters you want to play as. It doesn't much matter, they both play identically, it's just a matter of preference, but there are some rooms that only one or the other can access, but all this equates to is some occasional, very slight variation in the level design. I feel like I can identify with Tumble a little bit more than Ruff. I mean, I never knew any kids that carried a candle around with them all the time, but I sure as hell did carry around a stuffed toy with me when I was little. When the gameplay starts, you're in your house, and this serves as the game's hub world, and from here, you get to access a bunch of different worlds, which each contain 3 levels and a boss fight. Oh, you know what that really reminds me of? The whole idea of your house being the hub world. Rascal, of all things, go figure. The goal of any given level is to find and rescue all of the Winks. Most levels will have 2 to find, but a handful have 3. It's a pretty linear experience getting them all. You'll mostly navigate corridors and solve a series of rooms. Most doors will require having collected a certain amount of cogs to open, while others might need you to press a switch or defeat a bunch of enemies. The combat is super duper simple, which is what I like to see in platformers of this scope. I find a lot of times when developers try to add either ambitious or complicated combat into platformers, it kinda takes the focus away from what they're originally going for, and the game could end up becoming either tedious or aimless. Not to say this is always the case, some platformers manage to have super duper good combat, like Ratchet & Clank or, of course, Sphinx and the Cursed Mummy, but it has been more times than not in my experience reviewing B-grade platformers, so I do prefer to see them play it safe and focus on the platforming and making the combat simple. In this game, you've got a basic 3-hit combo, 1, 2, 3, just like Mario 64, and you've also got a projectile attack where you unleash this horrible wail at enemies. That sure does get annoying quickly, I'll tell you that right now. It's a lot easier on the ears if you're playing as Tumble, so if you find it annoying, I recommend switching to her. You will have to start a new game to do that though, which is kinda dumb. Unlike the 3-hit combo, this move depletes your energy, and you can recover that by collecting these moons that are scattered all around each level. It's got a lot longer range and is much stronger than your basic attacks, so you'll have to grab these when you can if you want to use it a lot. There's also a bunch of different forms you can take on as well. If you jump into one of these jack-in-the-box things, you transform into a brand new character. There's 4 total: a ninja, a caveman, a robot superhero dude, and a little jester guy. I like this one. You hear his little bells jingling as you walk around. That's adorable. The forms are consistent between both characters. You both turn into a caveman and a ninja, except the jester, that one's different. Tumble instead turns into a fairy princess. I love the premise of this. These kids having dreams where they're ninjas and fairies and stuff. It's really relatable and kinda cute.
Can I be a ninja?
Yes, but only if you're a nice ninja.
Taking on these forms increases your attack power significantly, and each one also has a unique version of the projectile move. The ninja throws these little ninja balls, the caveman barfs up some bones and stuff or something. I don't know what's going on there. The jester has this scattering attack, and the robot has the best one by a mile. It's got these homing missiles that go it just destroys everything. They're super handy for those annoying wall-mounted turrets or any enemy that's flying. I hate enemies that are flying because they're up there. I can't get up there. I can't shoot up there. Get down from there. And of course, each form has a unique ability that you'll have to use to progress through each stage. The caveman can ground pound through cracked floors, the ninja can climb across these ropes and poles, the robot's got this jetpack to boost yourself into the air, that's probably my favorite one, and the jester can, I don't know what the jester does. I think he can breathe underwater? You don't really need that though. I mean, he's got them jingling bells, but that doesn't really help me get through the stage. These power-up characters are reach on a time limit. From the moment you leave the jack-in-the-box, you'll have a timer at the top left, and when it counts down to 0, you'll go back to normal. But you can extend that by collecting character-specific tokens, and the way they pulled this off is actually pretty freaking smart. You know how Mario games often have rows of coins to bring your attention to certain areas, right? 40 Winks does that as well with these tokens, but since the tokens are character-specific, you only really notice them when you're in the required form, so this way the game can seamlessly guide you to where you need to go when you're in the proper form. You know, that really had me thinking about Donkey Kong 64, because a big complaint surrounding that game these days is how you have to keep switching characters because everything in the game is character specific, and I've heard some people offer the solution of mapping the Kongs to the D-pad so you can switch to any character at any given time. However, I really don't like that solution. I've never been a fan of it, because if you have access to all of the moves at all times, then what's even the point of spreading them across multiple characters? If you can just switch on the fly, then you might as well just play as one character that can do everything, instead of 5 characters that can each do some things. Now, the reason I bring this up is because 40 Winks is structured in a way that has you transforming into characters only when you need them, and then the game uses these tokens to veer you towards exactly where you need to use them. I think if DK64 employed this kind of design, it would be a much more interesting solution than just hacking every character into one big Transformo Kong. So instead of those universal character barrels barrels that are sprinkled throughout each course, why not have Kong barrels tailored towards singular Kongs, but only in the areas that you actually need to switch to them, and then use the colored bananas to guide you specifically to the objectives in question. This is a big part of why I really like reviewing games that not that many people remember or care about, because even if they're not terribly great games, you can still pick and choose ideas that work and then apply them to games that could have been better. Now, these power-ups aren't inherently just for character-specific actions, they also kind of double as crutch-like power-ups to make fighting and platforming a bit easier to handle, so when it comes to choosing one of these for just general gameplay, the Jester is easily my favorite. It does have the least implementations progress-wise, as I mentioned before, but it has a higher jump, and the 3-hit combo from this thing is devastating. Enemies don't stand a chance against that third strike. It makes a shockwave that knocks everybody over. I did find myself a tad frustrated with the game's enemies sometimes, though. Some levels get really stingy when it comes to health pickups, and some enemies can be pretty tough to beat without taking any damage in your base form, so depending on the level, you can find yourself in situations where you're only a few hits from dying, and then you gotta take on everything without making any mistakes. It can make the game a little bit stressful sometimes. Some of the prehistoric levels were really bad for this. There's these segments where you have to avoid these boulders, and they're so hard to get by without getting hit at least twice. And then you can't forget falling in a lava pit. That's a good way to drain all your life in seconds. It's like impossible to get back to solid ground once you're down there. Couldn't have the game done like a Wind Waker thing and just, oops, you fell down, I'll just take some of your health and put you back on ground? No, it's just gonna make you suffer down here until you're dead. And then these homing skull things that are impossible to dodge, these can die in a fire. Running out of lives starts the entire level over, and you can lose a lot of progress if that happens, so make sure you grab as many 1-up coins as you can. They're really hard to find, and there's not that many of them in each level, but 10 of them will give you an extra life. But even all of that's not as stressful as getting lost in this game. Like, remember those cogs? Most levels require having picked up every single last one in the stage to open the door, which means if you're a cog or two short when you get to one, it's time to backtrack throughout the entire level to look for it. Like a needle in a haystack. Once you learn to be as thorough as possible, make sure you've collected every single last thing before advancing, this becomes less of a problem, especially since the game is designed to roadblock you semi-frequently to make sure you didn't get too far without getting everything you need. But even in the later stages, there was the odd time I still had to go all the way back to tediously search for that last cog that I happened to miss. The level design in some areas really doesn't help either. A lot of levels look way too samey. Hallways are indistinguishable because they're all painted with the same texture sometimes, and there's not a whole lot of landmarks to help you keep a good sense of direction. This is especially a problem in the game's second world, which is full of water levels. And I know it's cliche to complain about water levels, but these ones seriously tested my patience. Not even because of the slower pace and the slightly slippery swimming controls, but because the entire level looks the same and I couldn't figure out where to go. Luckily though, and this is kind of unusual, I don't really see this a whole lot, but I found the later levels to suffer from this considerably less. The haunted world, the water world, and the space worlds all have this same issue, but the medieval and the pirate theme levels, they did a much better job. These later levels I found much easier to navigate. There's way more recognizable set pieces, and there's more variety in the environment, so it doesn't blend together as badly. Man, I tell ya, I was really worried this game was just gonna get worse and worse as the levels went on, but as I got further into it, I was pleasantly surprised to see that the game actually gets better as you go on. There are some stand-up levels in the earlier worlds too, though, like the Haunted Mansion and the Ancient Temple. These levels are both fun to play through and visually interesting and legible. Oh yeah, another big problem I had with the earlier worlds is the lighting. A lot of areas are way too dark. I can barely even tell what's going on at times, and it's especially annoying when there's enemies in the room and you can't even tell what you're trying to fight. The first boss was super annoying too. It's really hard to get in any hits on this thing without getting knocked around yourself. By the time I finally beat it, I was thinking, great, so the bosses in this game are gonna be like this, huh? But to my surprise, the other bosses weren't as frustrating. In fact, they were all pretty easy. Even the final boss, he's got a crap ton of health and it takes a long ass time to finish the fight, which was super annoying and tedious, but at least it wasn't unfairly difficult like the spider was. Now, the way you actually unlock these boss fights is really dumb. Since every level has you collecting that common thing, the winks, you know, the stars or jiggies of this game or whatever, you would think the game would have you collect a certain amount of them to unlock the fight. This way you can pick and choose what levels you want to do and which ones you want to slack off on. You know, the ideal platforming structure that was coined by Mario 64 and then applied to lots of other platformers. But that's not how it works here. Simply finishing a stage requires getting all of the winks in it, so by the end of the game you're just gonna have all 40 anyway, and that's fine. That just means you have to beat all the levels. I can do that, that's easy. They made the levels, I'm gonna play them, whatever, that's fine. But beating level 1, beating level 2, beating level 3, what comes next? Boss fight, right? No, beating the levels in that world does not unlock the boss fight. The way it works is there's 4 keys hidden in every level, so in addition to finding the winks, you also have to find these 4 keys. If you miss one, you have to research the entire level for it, and some of these are hidden in fairly missable locations too. I even had to use a walkthrough to find some of them. If you ask me, this is really stupid. This sort of thing should be saved for bonus levels or something. Basic progression should not be hidden behind annoying to find collectibles. Getting the main stuff should be all you need. I mean, like, I would understand doing this if they were hidden in open areas, like how Mario 64 and Banjo does its levels, but they're not. They're hidden in linear stages, so you have to replay entire levels if you miss them, and that's really time-consuming and really damn annoying. There's quite a number of things I don't really like about this game. I think the progression structure could have been handled better. I think the areas that are too dark to see are really annoying. I think the game is too hard to navigate sometimes because everything looks too samey, and some levels are way too stressful because the game just doesn't give you enough health pickups. But with all that said, there is a lot I do really like about this game as well. The overall progression structure is definitely something I'd change, but the level structures are pretty good. I might not really like how the game expects you to collect every last frickin' thing without missing any of it to get past those cog doors, but the way the power-ups are handled is really something I think is worth taking notes on. It's a hit-and-miss experience for sure. Mario's definitely not going to be moving over anytime soon, but there was enough here to make me come out of it feeling fairly good about it. Now, if you're wondering how it stacks up against the PS1 version, I'd say they both run pretty similarly. I did notice some slowdown and frame drops, but that seemed to be present in both versions. Of course, the PS1 version's gonna have that annoying texture wiggle that some people don't like, which is not on the N64 version, but that's just a quirk of the hardware and exists in most PS1 games, and I'm sure PlayStation users are just gonna be used to that. The N64 easily wins in the load time department. Transitions that are instantaneous on N64 require a loading screen on PS1. You'll never have to see this swirly load portal on the N64 version. Color is where I think the N64 gets beat though. The PS1 just has better colors, even against my RGB modded N64, and that issue I had with some areas being too dark is nearly non-existent in the PlayStation version. They're able to better communicate the darkness without totally stripping the player of the visual information they kinda need to play the game, and with the better looking and more plentiful cutscenes, I'd still say the PS1 version is the better option. But even still, as a piece of history, it is amazing that the N64 version is now in proper playable form, even if it didn't end up having all of the features that were promised back in the 90s. Yeah, remember those magazine previews? They promised multiplayer modes, both co-op and a battle mode exclusive to the N64 version. It would have been really cool to see them get those modes in the final release, but what can you do? Well, I guess when things finally do happen, there are still going to be some things that get left out, but all that really means is there's still value in reading those old magazines. Now, when you read through those previews, it's no longer like, oh yeah, I remember when this was going to be on N64. Now it's like, oh, I remember when this game was going to be different. And that's still pretty damn cool. Hey, just a quick heads up, the game's also available on Steam. I don't know much about that version and didn't really look into it, but I would assume it's probably the best version of it. I don't know. I don't like playing old low poly games in high res though, because it just looks so wrong to me. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter if you want to see me talk about how I poop my pants every day.